Unit 7, JFK, LBJ, and Civil Rights. So we have the 1960 presidential election. You have the Republican candidate, Richard Nixon. Nixon was an Eisenhower's vice presidential candidate. This guy's been vice president for 8 years. He's from California. He's very conservative. His faith is that he's a Quaker. He's in his late 50s. Then you have John F. Kennedy, a senator from Massachusetts. He's in his early 40s. He's a Catholic. He's, according to standards back then, especially from the ladies, he's an attractive guy. The Kennedy name, especially the Kennedy name around Boston, is synonymous with politics. Kennedy's father was a politician. His uncles are politicians. His cousins are politicians. I mean, it just stands to reason that Kennedy himself is going to be a politician. And Kennedy, when he runs for president, is really running on the premise of the Kennedy name more than he is anything else. What Nixon has going for him is this is the guy that was Dwight D. Eisenhower's vice presidential candidate. And Eisenhower's presidency, finished pretty strong. When Eisenhower was done, his approval rating was quite high. But nonetheless, what makes this election so unique is that it's the first time the debates between the candidates are going to be televised. The candidates have had debates in the past, but in the past they were always just done before a live audience and they were done over the radio. Now it's going to be aired out over network TV. And back during this time, whenever they would do something like this, the stage, as it was set up, had lights that would shine down to better illuminate the area where the people being filmed are going to be. These lights are very bright. They put off a lot of heat. And so it was recommended to both Kennedy and Nixon that they put on a little, light powder, not blush, but a little light powder, almost like talcum powder. And the reason for this is to try to absorb some of that initial perspiration. So, maybe you don't get like a reflection or something like that off your upper lip or your forehead. Kennedy had a little bit of or not Kennedy, but Nixon had a little bit of a receding hairline. And so, you wouldn't get that perspiration up there. And Kennedy's like, yeah, sure, go ahead and apply it. And Nixon's like, no, I don't want that. So the debate rolls around. And when the cameras would zoom in, you could see that Kennedy's eyes just kind of scanned over the live audience. And he sat there almost very stoic in his chair answering the questions. And Nixon, on the other hand, his eyes seemed to dart back and forth across the audience, and he was constantly rubbing the palms of his hands over the tops of his knees. And when they would zoom in, you could see perspiration forming on his upper lip and on his forehead. And it really gave the appearance that this guy was nervous, that this was an unnerving situation to have to answer these questions, off the cuff in front of a live audience was nerve-wracking to him. And you have to remember, this is the peak of the Cold War. What's going to happen if we're in a situation where we might have to launch a nuclear weapon? Is Nixon going to have the wherewithal to remain calm enough to make a rational decision? On the flip side, though, the people that only listened to the debate and did not watch it, they felt there was more substance in Nixon's answers, that when he answered the questions, he did so with, again, like I said, there's just more substance to his response. And sometimes maybe Kennedy was just adding a little more fluff and maybe sidestepping some of the questions. Nonetheless, when it came time for election day, it was a very close election, one of the closest ever in the history of presidential elections, and Kennedy ends up winning. And Kennedy and his wife, Jacqueline, and their two little kids move into the White House. And immediately the White House is given the nickname of Camelot. Camelot, King Arthur's court, kind of a fairy tale setting. And that's what the White House was like. You have this young, vibrant, good-looking president, his wife, who was equally attractive and a little younger than JFK himself, and then their two adorable kids. and you had the pitter patter of little feet, going through the White House as the kids would be running around. And for every younger couple across the United States, they wanted to be like the Kennedys. The Kennedys were the ultimate power couple, I guess you could say, of this era. But when it came to the politics itself, Kennedy did have a few struggles. First of all, his domestic program was called the New Frontier. And one of the reasons for that was because the Russians were way ahead of us when it came to the space race. And so one of the planks of Kennedy's campaign platform was the United States was going to be the first country to put a man on the moon. And so he considered space to be America's new frontier, so thus the nickname New Frontier. Now, when Kennedy was running for office and he was going around the country campaigning, one thing he did not do that candidates normally do is he did not campaign for other Democrats. You might think, well, why would he want to do that? Well, you have senators and representatives that are running for offices or running for their office in Congress. And if Kennedy can put in a good word, then that improves the odds that those Democrats are going to win the election. Then if you have a majority of the members of the Senate are Democrat and the majority of the members of the House are Democrat, and you have a Democratic president, normally more seems to get done. However, when Kennedy went from state to state, he did very little, if any, campaigning for his fellow Democrats. With Kennedy, it was really all about why JFK should be elected president and not why his fellow Democrats should be elected president. So when it comes time for JFK to try to get some of his domestic policy through Congress, he was unsuccessful with a bulk of it. What did he want done? He wanted more aid to education. Remember, Eisenhower cuts funding to education. He wanted to improve Social Security. He wanted to create a Department of Urban Affairs. At the end of last unit, when we were talking about the wealth of the United States, some of the people that were not enjoying the wealthy were those people that were living in the inner cities. And he wanted to help migrants, especially migrant workers. In reality, Congress did very little when it came to his domestic program. Kennedy was able to get the minimum wage raised. He was able to get some work done in their inner cities, and there were a few advancements in women's rights. But all in all, Kennedy did not have much success with his domestic policy. And it was really what happened on the campaign trail that did him in there. Now, Earl Warren is Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And under the Warren Court, there were some big-time landmark cases. I'm going to skip over Reynolds versus Sims. The next one I'm going to get to is Mapp versus Ohio. Mapp versus Ohio dealt with illegal search and seizure. Doreen Mapp lives in Ohio, and law enforcement shows up at her house, and they want to search her house because they say that she's harboring a fugitive. She's allowing someone who's wanted by law enforcement to live there. They want to search her house. She says, no, where's your search warrant? They didn't have one. Police leave. They come back, and they hold up a piece of paper, and they say, I have a search warrant. Let us search your house. She says, well, okay, where's my copy? Police said, no, you don't get one. Well, Doreen Mapp knows more than what the police give her credit for. So when they don't offer her a copy, she refuses to let him in. They say, you have to let us in. We have a search warrant. So she snatches the search warrant out of the officer's hand, and she stuffs it down her blouse, thinking the police are not going to go after it. Well, she was wrong. The police hold her down. They retrieve said search warrant, and they search her house. Well, turns out that they don't find the person that they're looking for, but what they do find is what they deem lewd and lascivious material, inappropriate magazines, if you want to call them that, and that violates an old Ohio statute. So Doreen Mapp is arrested for that. Case ends up going to trial. And she ends up being found guilty of possessing it. But the real thing was, it wasn't her guilt of possessing it. It was, should that, what was found, should that have been allowed as evidence in court? Because the search warrant, which never was really a search warrant, wasn't for that. It was for something else. Well, Mapp versus Ohio said, if you're going to use evidence in a court case, the evidence has to be obtained legally, and the evidence in this case was not obtained legally. Then there's Gideon Wainwright. Gideon breaks into a pool hall in Florida. He busts some vending machines and takes money out of the vending machines. He steals some cigarettes. He steals some alcohol. He's arrested. He goes to court. Well, he says, I want a court-appointed attorney. Well, Florida state law says a court-appointed attorney is only given to you if your case involves corporal punishment or capital punishment, which means the potential sentence is death. Well, that was not a potential sentence for Gideon. You're not going to get the death penalty for breaking and entering. So Gideon is forced to have to represent himself. Not knowing anything about law, he doesn't know how to conduct himself in court, and he's found guilty, sentenced to prison. While he's in prison, he decides he's going to do some investigating. He uses the library at the prison and finds out that he should have been given a lawyer. He appeals his case and ends up going to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, doesn't matter how large or small a case is. If a person cannot afford an attorney, then a court-appointed attorney needs to be provided for them. Then you have Miranda versus Arizona. Ernesto Miranda is arrested for kidnapping and rape. He's held for about 6 to 8 hours without an attorney, and law enforcement ends up getting a confession from him. He's found guilty and he's sentenced to prison. Well, it turns out that he was unaware that he had the right to remain silent. He also did not know that anything he was saying was going to be used against him in a court of law. So he and his lawyers appeal their case. It ends up going to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court hands down or rules in the case Miranda versus Arizona that suspects must have their rights read to them, and they need to understand these rights. So that's why today, when a person is arrested, they are told that they have the right to remain silent. Anything they say can and will be used against them in a court of law. They have the right to an attorney. If they cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed to them. And then they're asked the question, do they understand those rights as they've just been read? Those rights are called your Miranda rights because of Ernesto Miranda. Then there's the situation dealing with separation of church and state. That, and really one of the main places was the schools. It was very commonplace in schools throughout the country, as public schools, that you started the day with a prayer. I am going to end these notes right here.